Welcome back to the Warbird Mistress, and I know this video's been a little delayed, but instead of just doing the model building, I realized that a full video on the Ki-49 Donryu, the otherwise better known as the Helen, is really called for, because when I went out there, I realized that there's really not a lot of coverage about the Helen. In fact, there's very little motion picture footage, and I scoured everything. I looked at Japanese sources, English-speaking sources, you name it, I looked at it. And there was really not a lot out there, which is half expected, but so here we have both. I'm discussing the model, and I'm discussing the actual Ki-49 herself. So, the Nakajima Type 100 Army bomber, the Ki-49 Donryu, or Storm Dragon, was a twin-engined, allegedly heavy bomber designed to carry out long-range daylight strategic bombing missions, penetrating enemy territory over northern China, the Soviet Far East, the Tibetan Plateau of Qinghai, and without the protection of any escort fighters. Now, she famously did not live up to that. Her official designation as a heavy bomber was accurate only as in regards her formidable defensive armament compared to the Sally and Nell, and also her innovative use of armor. Unfortunately, she had a small payload, limited range, and little roll flexibility. The Ki-49 had payloads comparable to, or even notably inferior to, those of medium bombers that were about her size and came out of the same time frame. The Helen could carry a mere 2,200 pounds of ordnance, so she falls into that category of Axis bombers that were heavy for the people using them, but medium bombers as far as everyone else would be concerned. So, keep that in mind when we're going through this. For comparison, since she may look like a larger aircraft than she is, I'm going to cover it briefly now, though. She's about the same size as contemporary light and medium bombers like the Douglas Havoc, Martin Baltimore, Tupolev SB-2, Fiat BR-20. She had a slightly larger wingspan than the SB-2, shorter than the BR-20. She was longer than all of these except for the BR-20, but she had a much larger crew. She had no fixed armament, but again, she wasn't really designed for that. And I know that the Baltimore could have another 4 rear-facing 30 cals, but let's ignore that weirdness. I'll also get into the time they put a doggone 75mm field gun underneath her to shoot down American bombers, but yeah, hold up for that one. It's a total dumpster fire of a deployment history. You'll enjoy it. In terms of defensive armament, she had much more than the others, with a 20mm cannon in the tail, as well as beam positions. No other similar craft had a nose gun that the lighter Havoc probably didn't need, but the Baltimore and SB-2 lacked. Her bomb load was pitiful compared to the Havoc or BR-20, but she was not dissimilar from the others shown here, or in general. And that's especially considering the fact that Japanese single-engine aircraft, like the Anne or Val, carried very light bomb loads compared to their allied equivalents. The Val, for instance, had about half the payload of a Dauntless. Now, she was not bad where maximum speed was concerned, but she was a slow cruiser. In fact, she had performed about the same as a Sally, and both of them were interceptable by American aircraft, or a Commonwealth aircraft for that matter. For range, she's clearly not up to the role of a strategic heavy bomber. She's not getting bang for her buck, and I wouldn't doubt if her somewhat dated wing design didn't hold her back in this regard. A lot more lift, a little slower cruising might have made her a better airspace penetrator. The weight of the extra crewmen certainly didn't help either, and she still would have been vulnerable. So again, keep this in mind when you're looking at the model or seeing the photographs and motion pictures in here. Now, the model from F-Toys, which I bought from Baron Vlad on eBay, of course belongs to the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, and it's from the 74th Hiko Sentai, painted in Type C camouflage scheme. Now, that scheme was a less common one, but was an option from 1938 through to the end of the war. The Type C was made up of alternating segments or bars of dark green, green, and brown upper surfaces, and a light gray-green lower surface paint. And this looks about right, if a bit too clean. That's one of the things I had a problem with in this. I couldn't quite figure out how to weather the model. Anyway, the scheme was pretty rare after the onset of the war, though, especially in New Guinea, but it was not unknown. It's kind of weird that the Helen is depicted this way. But I did find a photo that I think shows a similar kind of arrangement, albeit from a different unit and without the cross emblem on the empennage. Speaking in which, frankly, I find it amusing that in such close proximity to Timor-Leste that there's this insignia that resembles the Portuguese Cruz do Rei de Cristo. Of course, Japan conquered that particular part of overseas Portugal in their invasion of the Netherlands East Indies, and there were no Portuguese air assets there, so I've always kind of wondered what that insignia is. If you know, tell me in the comments, please. Now, the model itself was not difficult to build. The sprues, however, did not inspire confidence when I first inspected the parts. I thought it would be more difficult to separate them out, but it turned out to be just fine. Some minor sanding at the junctions and all was good. It came with options to have the bomb bay doors open or closed and the landing gear retracted or lowered. Now, since it was such an inexpensive model, I kind of liked that. I chose to show the bay open and the landing gear lowered, but if it weren't glued in place, one could likely switch them around as desired, carefully. I did have to take apart the somewhat pre-assembled bits. For example, this is not a single-piece fuselage, despite it being packaged that way. The pieces came right apart, and with a little light sanding and cementing, the halves fit together much better, still not perfectly, but it gave a nice appreciation for the shape and how radical a departure it is from the cigar-shaped Sally and Betty, or even the Nell, which was more square. If anything, it reminded me a great deal of building a Mitchell. Now, of course, at this scale, it is 1/144. There's no real interior detail of which to speak, so I'm not going to even touch on that. I didn't expect it. The glass sections are solid clear plastic, and they fit together quite well. I could have sanded the cockpit piece a little bit better, but it is what it is. I was happy that the paint didn't flake in the slightest when it sanded. I wasn't sure exactly how that paint was in there, or how the pieces were formed. And I just used a very fine rasp and some sanding sticks to do it. Nothing fancy, and it came out fine. I was also afraid of having to do some touch-up work, but I didn't. That being said, as much as she's called a toy, I can't see anyone seriously building these who doesn't have experience with models. I was apprehensive about buying them for that reason, but I'm happy to say that these are, in fact, model airplanes. They just happen to be pre-painted. That's really the only thing that's both a comfort to me, because I don't have the room for painting. Again, I don't really have a room to call my own, so it's kind of hard, but these are, in fact, models. So if they look appealing to you, I'd say that they're worth the purchase. If you are someone who's going to look at extreme detail on a 1/144 scale, honestly, I'm just going to ask you for the number for your optometrist. If you can, congratulations. I think I know a housefly that needs a colonoscopy. That being said, there were some flaws. The landing gear was a tiny smidge uneven, but only because of the way that the aft support spar mounts. I left that unglued for now until I figure out how best to rectify that. Worst come to worst, I clip the landing gear off, carve out the open bay door pieces, and replace it with the closed gear doors and closed bay. One thing that is lacking, but I could probably fix it with a tiny bit of paint and a microscope, is the defensive ventral and beam positions. Now, the Helen did not usually have the guns extended in the beam positions, and they were very small openings, so that's not really a major concern of mine. They did a great job with the dorsal and tail guns. Nose looks good, but there's no hint of where the other guns might be. I do like the open bomb bay because it shows the unique position in which the bombs were carried. They weren't side by side necessarily. The Japanese staggered the way that they were mounted, and it's definitely a carryover from the streamlining found in the Ki-19 design, which I'll get into. The Japanese Army was not really great at prioritizing ordnance layouts for versatility, and it shows. I think these are slightly large for 220-pound bombs, so those might be supposed to be two 550-pound bombs in there. Likewise, it does give a bit of foreshadowing of the Army's disappointment in the Helen's lack of real striking power. Now, the decals as well. I feared tearing them because I had torn them when I built the Claude, but these cooperated. I did use decal seal to clean that up at the end, so it solved the problem that they weren't sticking quite nicely. I would also say that the wing is depicted is okay, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of shape, but it missed out on the opportunity to show off the unique geometry offered by the huge flaps, and just, some of the angles that are seen in the Helen's wing are a little off. There should be a little bit more of a shift where the flaps end, and the trailing edge angle is also a bit sharper. Now, the engine nacelles are maybe a millimeter too wide as well, but these are little things, and it makes it more like it's almost successor to the Peggy as far as I'm concerned. but for the price and for the way it arrives, I'm not complaining. All in all, I like the model. I'm keeping her, obviously. I'm sorry I couldn't get the whole build on video, but that's also one of the reasons why I'm making up for this now with a more traditional video. So, let's get into the plane herself. But first, I want to give a big thank you to all my sponsors, and to, if you're not a sponsor, if you're not a subscriber, go and hit that subscribe button, the bell for notifications. And people always ask me, what helps the channel most? Honestly, views, of course, count in just raw numbers. So does watch time. If you're just going to watch for 30 seconds, it doesn't count nearly as much of, say, 10 people doing that as one person watching it all the way through. So, if you want to help the channel out, just watch it all the way to the end, or even just let it play, because that really does make a difference. But again, thank you for all your support, and let's get into the academics of it. So Nakajima was Japan's first aircraft manufacturer, and it was considered to be primarily a fighter design firm by the time the competition for a heavy bomber came about in the late 30s. Their Ki-27 Nate, after all, made them a favorite of the Army, as it basically wowed over China, where the Kawasaki Ki-10 really couldn't carry the day at all against the Chinese or Soviets. And it marked the re-entry of Nakajima into the Army fighter role, since their hugely successful Type 91 fighter of 1931. The Ki-10 you'll see here in the cinematic role of Chinese fighters against the Ki-27 Nate, by the way, from the 1940 film Burning Sky. Now, the Ki-43 Hayabusa was well in the planning stages, as was the Ki-44 Shoki. Other advanced fighter designs were, kind of on the plate for Nakajima, and for a bomber, their B-5N Kate was a huge step forward for the Navy. The B-6N was being designed as an advanced torpedo bomber and recce plane, and while all the reconnaissance float planes that they'd put out basically made their mark aboard every Japanese capital ship for over a decade. Now, Nakajima was interested in multi-engine aircraft, but their reputation as a capable and innovative designer of single-engine craft was well established, even though they were building DC-2s under license and had other experience with some foreign designs and some of their own domestic ones. But they had a big rival, and that was Mitsubishi. So this rivalry was only aggravated further as the latter had won over the Army and the Navy with their performance with the Ki-21 Sally and G3M Nell over China, the A5M Claude, the buzz about the upcoming design that would be the Betty, and of course the soon-to-be-released A6M Zeke. Now, as Nakajima knew, the Nate's days were numbered, and Nakajima and the Army needed a win over Mitsubishi and the Navy to stay in the game. When Army insiders in 1938 hinted to the company that the Sally was about to be replaced, Nakajima was determined to knock Mitsubishi for a loop. After all, their innovative Ki-19 had lost out to the Ki-21 in the bid to replace Mitsubishi's Ki-1, the Ki-1 being both hopelessly dated and as ugly and awkward as one could imagine. The Ki-19 had several advantages over the little Mitsubishi Sally, but the Sally won the day, and it impressed the Army, but that didn't mean it was perfect. Nakajima's independent LB-2 bomber project was also promising, but the Navy rejected it as they were already committed to the Betty, and they were quite happy with the Betty, being a very long-range, capable, level, and torpedo bomber. They did, however, have success with their four-engine heavy bomber design, and that's the G5M Shinzan. When it was accepted for the Navy for development, it was basically Japan's only serious strategic bomber design. And they also had extensive experience at Nakajima with twin-engine transports, like I said. They had license-built DC-2s, DC-3s, they had the Ki-34, but now it was their chance to regain the lead against their main rival, Mitsubishi, and to do it while their scars from the Ki-19 and LB-2 were still fresh. For this task, Nakajima's most innovative thinker, Tei Koyama, was made the project chief. He was a fighter expert. Assisting him was the fighter expert, father of Japanese rocketry and space technology, and all-around genius, Dr. Hideo Itokawa. He was supposed to help with streamlining, planning defenses, improving maneuverability and stability, basically ensuring optimal performance. And the third guy in the team was Dr. Setsuro Nishimura, and he had worked on Nakajima's license-built DC-2s and on the Ki-19 project. So he was brought on to design and supervise the actual architecture of the aircraft. Now, as much as this was Nakajima's dream team, their attentions were divided. Koyama was preoccupied with his new design, which he was also the chief engineer, and that would become the Ki-44 Tojo. Itokawa was working on his baby, the Ki-43 Oscar, and Nishimura couldn't do his job without a dedicated chief and a designer with clear priorities and expectations. Project management really fell behind in this case. The structural problems and unanswered design questions plagued Itokawa and the others, and his team's potential collaborative power never truly coalesced, so nobody really knew what they were supposed to be designing. And Nishimura put together a design that was his best guess of what was needed. In the end, the proposals were made, and Nakajima still beat out Mitsubishi. That was the sole challenger, and I can't even see that a prototype was ever built. This would have been the Mitsubishi Ki-50, although that number was later reassigned. They just didn't see it as having the capacity for independent operation over unfriendly skies, and that was the main issue they were having with the Sally, as the Chinese Air Force was getting bulked up, and they feared that more modern Russian fighters would decimate any bomber force. So Mitsubishi could not escape the shadow of the Sally, and Nakajima was left to take the contract for this fast, nimble, heavy bomber that could defend herself on strategic bombing missions over the Asian continent. A mid-wing cantilever monoplane of all-metal construction, the Helen was one of the first Japanese aircraft fitted with a retractable tailwheel, so, alright, go genius team. Now the Helen had influences other than the Ki-19, especially the Fowler flaps, some of the architecture. A lot of it came from experience with the Lockheed 14 Super Electra, and a lot of the other experience with the DC-2 that Nakajima had made its way into the plane. In fact, the Helen, as much big as she might seem, is about the same dimensions as the Super Electra's twin, the Hudson, except for she was 10 feet longer, so she had that stretched out look. And of course she strongly resembled the Ki-19. The internal bomb bay was not at all a new feature to the Japanese, but without better powerplants and a more robust airframe, she could only carry the 2,200 pounds of ordnance that I mentioned. Ideally, twice this load or even a torpedo load was planned, but that wasn't to be. Helen was neither structurally strong enough nor mechanically capable of mounting larger ordnance devices, and the Army had actually only requested a medium bomb load. By contrast, when the Sally had won the contract for a medium bomber, the Army had asked for twice that payload. So, not sure what they were doing by reducing that, and yet still claiming they wanted a strategic bomber. It could just be that they realized that there were certain limitations to the Japanese technological capabilities at the time, and that they really wanted a long-distance strike bomber with strong defenses and were willing to settle for a smaller bomb load. Or they could have just given in to Nakajima telling them what to do. Some of the intrigue there is not easy to research. And in fact, as comparable to the Ki-19 as the Helen was, the designers lost a lot of the streamlining that the Ki-19 had incorporated, and there was also no chance to mount external hardpoints or strengthening the interior structure for a greater internal capacity. So she maintained that same bomb load, but couldn't even really come up with the same speed or agility that the Ki-19 had. Again, the Ki-19, however, really lost out against the Sally because it wasn't able to have this 3,300-pound bomb load. And that really just kind of, it makes it even more ironic that the Helen was chosen. Now in service, the Helen's normal bomb load would be about 1,650 pounds, and usually would be 3 250-kilogram bombs to make that up, although 4 could be carried, and the huge flaps actually allowed for a fine takeoff. The problem was her in-flight capabilities after the takeoff. So she kind of pushed her flight performance towards the end of her envelope, and she was definitely an underpowered aircraft, but she was not a dangerous aircraft to fly, loaded out with ordnance. Now, the one benefit of carrying 2 500-kilogram bombs, besides saving the weight of the extra casings and assemblies, is that the Japanese 250-kilogram bomb was 16.5 inches in diameter, while the 500-kilogram bomb was only 14.5 inches in diameter, while being 13 inches longer and with a larger tail assembly. Thus, they could be mounted in the bay staggered, just as shown in the model. The design of the bomb bay itself didn't help. As you can see here, the fuselage was not designed to have a large bomb bay like the Lank or the Liberator. In fact, it was tucked into the pre-existing design. Like other Japanese designs, she also lacked the potential for versatility that similar designs in Allied forces had, such as the Mitchell, Invader, or Boston, or even the German medium jack-of-all-trade, the U-88. She had much more in common with Italian and Russian designs of limited versatility and only mediocre operational capacity, and a lot of that had to do with the lack of adaptability in her bomb load. So there was no way to really have combinations of armament such as racks of incendiaries or dozens of small anti-personnel munitions. There was really no thinking outside the box here in terms of role adaptability and versatility, despite the Japanese having well-designed ordnance like the half-kilogram Type 99 and 30-kilogram Type 99 HE munitions, the 15-kilogram Type 96 frag bomb, the 12-kilogram Type 97 thermite bomb, the 50-kilogram Type 100 phosphorus incendiary. They never really thought to use them in bundles like the Allies did, or to pack them into their bombers like the Helen could have easily done. And it really limited them from effective tactical use of medium bombers, and as we get into the Helen's service history, I think you'll see that. Now, one thing that was new, and I mentioned this before, was her defensive armament. The Army was facing a lot more determined Chinese resistance in the air and feared that the potential for new warplanes from Americans, Italians, and Commonwealth forces entering Chinese service would have really just challenged them more than they were ready to handle. And they knew they needed better defenses, let alone if they were going to go up against the Russians. Now, unlike the Navy, the Army fighters were not planned to have the incredible range of a Claude or Zeke. The new Nate, for example, had about half the range of a Claude. The Army planned that the Helen would have to go to the dance without an escort, and she'd have to hold her own for the night. And that's why the Helen not only bristled with nose, dorsal, ventral, and bilateral beam machine guns, she also became the first Japanese aircraft to mount a defensive 20mm cannon. And that cannon would also make the Helen the first aircraft with a powered turret. Now, the 20mm would tear up the biplanes and the unarmored monoplanes of the Chinese Air Force, and offer a solid defense against the next generation of warplanes that the Allies would have coming up with, including the American warplanes. And it also makes the tail end of the Helen one of her most recognizable features, with that unique turret face there. Now, once her design was complete and her production underway, the initial testing had to be completed before the Helen was ready to see action. And this would begin when she went operational for the first time in autumn of 1941, and that was in China, where the Army first really thought of her being. Of course, this is before the war with the United States began. So individual Sally units received handfuls and single examples of the new Donryu in order to see how she would do in the operational setting, and she fared acceptably, but she wasn't really considered a great improvement over the Sally. They tested her in northern China, where there really wasn't that much air opposition, and with the risk of war with the Soviet Union decreasing, compared with the mediocre bomb load and range of the Helen, they really didn't see her as this great investment. In fact, her operational ceiling was 3,000 feet below that of the Sally, so how she would have fared over the Tibetan Plateau in a westward offensive or in an attack against India would be debatable at best. However, no unit would be outfitted in China at that point, so she was merely being tested on the easy setting. In fact, these very first Helens in China weren't even bombers. These were the Ki-58 Army Experimental Convoy Fighter. These three prototype models were designed to escort Ki-21 Sallys getting pummeled by a resurgent Republican Chinese Air Force. Of course, they were just testing them in the north. The real problems were the Chinese Air Force gaining a lot of strength in southern China. So flying out of Fusa, these Helens had their bomb bays covered with a plate and supports for a gondola or blister structure on the keel, had a second dorsal turret installed, a forward ventral position placed, and they had 5 20mm cannon bristling forth and 3 12.7, not 7.7mm machine guns. And the arrival of another Nakajima, the Ki-43 Oscar, kind of meant that this was unnecessary, but to see just this heavily armed, as they called it, convoy fighter, put forward, well before the Americans really thought of anything with the B-17 being adapted for such a role, and also just this fact that the Japanese were testing this to make up for fighters that were about to be replaced by modern examples anyway, it just kind of made it all redundant. But an interesting kind of redundant. Now in September 1941, so, really just a couple weeks later, when the first standard Helens came off the line, by the time of Pearl Harbor, only 29 bombers had actually been completed. plus 3 Ki-58s, which I just described, and a pair of Ki-80 command and control variants. And the Army was really trying to get their most out of the airframe. This pair, known as the Ki-80s, were designed for Army regimental commanders to use for aerial observation. The bomb bay was shortened, so she had only an abbreviated bomb load. She had more defensive guns. They were 12.7mm, all of them, plus the 20mm cannon. She had a lot more communications equipment put in there, and Japanese radios were bulky. They weren't that great, but they needed them for this role. And they weren't really fielded for long. It turned out that this idea just kind of fizzled out in a matter of weeks. They ended up being used as test beds for potential power plant upgrades, and interestingly enough, they might have actually served in a second role, that of Pathfinder, but again, researching the Helen is not an easy task. There's a reason it took me a week just to get my notes together. The American sources list her as a Pathfinder model, whereas the Japanese list her as observation, command and control, and used by ground commanders as well as air commanders. Now, we know that later on the Helens were used as transports and even as paratrooper carriers. So one of the things that I think if you combine the sources, it might show that they began as command and control aircraft for Army commanders, and then tried to be used as Pathfinders later, and then at the end they were just relegated to testing for the potential Helen 3 that never came about. But anyway, it's a lot. I know. I admit that this video is not brought to you by the letter's overwhelming information. In fact, like I said, researching the Helen is just a chore. My Japanese is limited to what the internet can offer me in terms of translation, and it's if it's not Romanized, I really can't read it at all. So, again, if you know anything or have a great source, please let me know. Now, the Pacific War really brings us to a philosophical matter, that the raison d'etre to the Helen was going to war over the continent, not the Pacific. So constantly taking doctrine and equipment meant for a land war against China, Mongolia, and the USSR, and adapting that to meet a long-range overwater war for resources in far-flung places against modern enemies was a huge challenge for the Japanese Army. In interviews of POWs, the Japanese Navy, in fact, ridiculed the Army for not wanting to fly over water, while also noticing that the Army just didn't have the navigational experience or even navigational equipment to fly over water for more than just short distances. So this was a well-known issue. But this is where the inter-sibling rivalry of Army and Navy just makes Japan stand out more than any other nation in terms of how much each service just hated each other. And to put this in perspective, I mean, as much as I might joke about the Navy being the world's most expensive taxi service, or about the Army aren't ready for the Marines yet, or the Air Force for being the Air Force, it's all in good fun. And in Japan, you're literally talking about a branch of service forced into a war by another branch in the 1930s, only for the Navy to then force the Army into a Pacific War later. The political ramifications of military decisions and this whole ability for low-rank officers to overthrow the orders of higher-ranking officers, to countermand orders, and it's basically how the war in China started. And then on the Navy side to, almost try to regain control of influence in the imperial household by subverting the Army and beginning this whole war in the Pacific. It's incredible to even think about. But all of these shortcomings of the Japanese Army Air Service are the direct result of Japan choosing the Nanshiron, the Southern Advance argument, and that was the plan of the Japanese Navy, a plan diametrically opposed to the Army's plan of Asian expansion, known as the Northern Advance argument, or Hokushiron. The Army saw the ideal war as one of expansion into Outer Mongolia, the Soviet Far East, and even Turkestan, while fighting a defensive conflict in southern China and the Pacific. Fewer nations would be involved, the war could be contained as Japan wished, which is very important in warfare, and raw materials would be easily exploited and transported to manufacturing centers to both sustain Japan and the war effort. The Army's goal was to gain access to the resources of Siberia, Irkutsk, and Vladivostok while cutting China in half in a strike from Japanese-controlled Inner Mongolia towards Tibet. However, despite the more limited Kantokuen plan gaining some favor for a brief time to coincide with Operation Barbarossa, and this was a plan to basically take parts of Soviet Far East and possibly Mongolia as well, since Mongolia was acting as a Soviet puppet. The army was really just losing ground in the Imperial General Headquarters, and their plans for northern expansion were tempered by the oil embargo and their failures at Khalkhin. So the Navy's plan, which was the one for which the Japanese Army and the Japanese Army Air Service was completely unequipped and unprepared to fight, was chosen as the best option to gain oil, rubber, food, and other resources in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and, for some reason, the American Pacific Holdings. Again, why strike America? They could have gotten what they wanted otherwise, but that's history. Anyway, rock, meet hard place. So at the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Army needed bombers, and they needed them quickly. The ease with which the Allied air forces had been beaten back from the Philippines, American island bases, and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, as well as the sparsely populated and basically undefended British, Australian, and Kiwi Pacific mandates, at first made the problems experienced by the Army over China and Mongolia seem to be a thing of the past, and that the Sally and Helen would be sufficient. Now, the Japanese kind of knew that they were invincible, but they also knew that their new bomber was awkward icing on a beautiful, flimsy cake. So like the prototype, these early versions were armed with 5 7.7mm machine guns, which were basically useless against Allied fighters, and one 20mm cannon. In a first for Japanese aircraft, armor for the pilots and crew, as well as self-sealing fuel tanks. In the beginning, the air war was going well, and this was absolutely believed by all involved. There was no evidence to say otherwise. Just as the Americans had underestimated the Japanese air abilities, the Japanese had severely underestimated American air capabilities. Now, up until the spring of 1942, the Helens were all allocated to the heavy bomber school at Hamamatsu, and on an individual basis, as I said, to Sally units in China as a provisional way of carrying out conversion training and operational testing. Now, she would finally see action when in July 1942, the 61st Hikosentai became the first Donryu unit, and they began to train for actual combat operations in the Pacific. Now, this would take almost a year to finally complete. The ground elements were sent ahead to prepare for the mission. They trained non-stop for all these months, until finally in June 1943, the 61st departed Hamamatsu and was headed for Kendari on Celebes with the majority of active Helens available. Now, with only 20 to 30 coming out of Nakajima every month, and with some being diverted to form what would become the 74th Hikosentai that was bound for Manchuria, this was the only combat unit really to get the Helen, and it was hard to grow the force. But the 61st stayed together and was ready to be the tip of the spear for the Japanese Army Air Force. Now, over the month of June, the bombers made their way south to Truk by boat, where they were then ferried to Rabaul and Kendari. Now, they had to be assembled at Truk, then they were flown to Rabaul, and it was really just not a good flight. Now, the flight to there and just the maintenance of the aircraft was already proving to be difficult for the Army. Now, at Kendari, they were fairly inactive, since the Army was preparing for strikes against Darwin in the summer of 43, but kind of holding back, so they could really mount up their strength as best as they could. Now, the Navy's Bettys were no stranger to Darwin, and the Army Air Force kind of didn't want to be kept out of hitting the Allies at home. They had to make their name for themselves, and as the newest bomber in the infantry, the Army selected the Helen to carry this out. Now, they reached Kendari early in July, and they settled in, prepared for their raid, which was launched on the 20th of July 1943 against Darwin. 18 Helens, together with 22 Oscar escorts and 12 Lilies from coordinating squadrons, flew slowly but surely toward the target and came over Darwin at 10:43 hours. They then spread out to attack Winelli and the airfield at Darwin. However, they were quickly pounced by Spitfires of 5-4 Squadron RAF and numbers 452 and 457 Squadrons RAAF. Now, 2 Helens were destroyed over the target, a third limped back only to crash on Timor, and another 2 were heavily damaged and rendered hors de combat. 2 Lilies were also forced to crash land on Timor, and 1 Oscar was lost over the target. Further Allied claims of Japanese losses are unsubstantiated, although it might be thought that 2 more Oscars were damaged beyond repair. Now, further raids yielded similar outcomes, all with minimal damage, if any, to the target, and severe damage to the Japanese aircraft involved. As can be said about any plan, the idea about using the Helen to deal devastating strikes against Australia did not survive first contact with the enemy. While the Helen may theoretically have been deadly to Chinese fighters in unarmored, often primitive planes that the Sally was used to encountering, they were not suitable for facing the Allied fighters of 1942, let alone 1943. With crews too used to slower, dated aircraft found over China, and unprepared for the firepower and speed of American and Commonwealth fighters, they were plagued by the same problems as the Sally. The Helen proved to be almost no improvement. According to Fumizo Komine History Group's Japanese volume on the aircraft, gratefully translated thanks to some tinkering with Adobe and Google, it seems that most Japanese aircrews actually preferred the Sally. They found the engines more reliable and that it was more comfortable an airframe to operate. Personally, I kind of find that interesting since the Sally seems really cramped, and the Helen was comparatively roomy inside and even suitable as a freight and troop transport. The shape of the aircraft gave itself to that, versus the tight cigar shape kind of build that the Sally had. And after all, it lacked the internal communication systems familiar to Allied aircrew aboard strategic bombers, so having 8 guys on the inside of a small airframe, at least they could talk to each other. The Sally had a much smaller crew, and communication was basically non-existent at times between crew members. And yet, the Japanese seemed to have preferred the Sally. But anyway, some of these initial issues with the Helen were solved by the improved Ki-49 2A. Even heavier armor, more powerful Ha-109 engines, self-sealing tanks were improved with newer technology, and in the 2B variant, the 12.7mm Ho-103 guns took the place of all but the 2 beam machine guns, which were still 7.7mm single mounts. But the slow deployment of these examples, and the heavy armor of American Army Air Force fighters, especially when you consider the heavy armament too of the P-38 entering the match, and improved marks of the Hurricane and Spitfire into the field, as well as the improving skills of the Allied pilots at the controls, all meant that no matter how much better these marks were, the Helen was still at a severe disadvantage. And it didn't help that by now Japan was fighting a war of attrition. Even ferrying aircraft would be deadly when it came to replace the Ki-49 ones and just generally reinforce the 7th Air Army, or Hikoshidan. I've also seen it called an air division. And they were stationed in Netherlands, East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomons areas. Now first, Helens were shipped to Truk on Army vessels, as I mentioned, and then flown 800 miles from Truk to Rabaul. But there was little time to do any maintenance, and there was just no way of navigating, so they had to have a navigational escort, which surprisingly was actually provided by the Japanese Navy. Now, the Army couldn't even use their radios over these waters, so without that escort, there was no communication in any way, shape, or form. These waters were controlled by the Japanese Navy, and the Japanese Army did not use compatible radio sets. So after a few practice runs, 24 Ki-49-2s flew to Rabaul. Out of those 24, 2 arrived. Now, those are 22 bombers that the Japanese desperately needed, and they were all lost over waters controlled by the Army's worst enemy, the Navy, so rescue or even... there was no way to know that these men were even out there. Now, a second route was adopted, and Helens and Sallys would now fly from Hamamatsu to Iwo Jima, Guam, Saipan, Truk, and then Rabaul. But still with no radio contact with the ground, no meteorological updates, and there was a need to conserve fuel that, in the end, ended up actually costing more aircrew and machines, due to poor fuel efficiency. Now finally the Army was forced to ferry bombers over Army-friendly areas, and they would start at Army bases in Kyushu, fly to Formosa, the Philippines, Palau, Wewak, and eventually Rabaul. And it cost fuel, morale, wear and tear, and especially wear and tear on a temperamental aircraft not particularly suited to tropical operations in an assault-ridden environment. When they arrived, they found the base was under nearly constant assault by the Allies. Of the 300 Army and Navy aircraft present in the spring of 1943, which included 40 Helens and 50 other bombers that were mostly Lilies and Sallys from the Army, constant bombing meant that the 250 aircraft were destroyed without even leaving the ground by July. The Army kept piling in more bombers until in August they finally just pulled back to Wewak, where 300 aircraft were stationed with their miserable, grumbling collection of unhappy campers not wanting to fight and burdened by tropical disease and poor supply lines. All of this does not mean that the Helen's potential went unappreciated by the Allies. And it's a little ironic here, because at first little was known about the aircraft except what the Japanese media had lauded as some new amazing weapon, which they did about everything. And that changed little after the first encounters. The Helen was really just a name until the one was shot down over Darwin. It was actually retrieved with most of its significant parts still intact. And in December, another Helen, almost completely intact, was discovered by the Marine Corps when the airfields of Cape Gloucester on New Britain were captured. So Allied Tactical Air Intelligence actually found it very easy to learn about the Helen. They found it to be the best armed, best defended Japanese Army bomber. They said it shared an engine with the Tojo, which was correct. They even expected it to be significantly better than the Sally and thought it made a good opponent. It honestly sounds like they considered it about even with their own medium bombers. The Japanese did not agree. Commanders disliked her, pilots disliked her, they thought she was too slow, she was underarmed for all the investment in new power plants and improved construction compared to the Sally. Her range of 1,200 miles was 500 miles shorter than the Sally's. Her cruising speed and her top speeds made her about the same as the Sally, coming in at 220 miles per hour and 300 miles per hour, respectively. She weighed about the same, but she required more maintenance. She was not as nimble as the Sally. And with increased armament in the later marks of the Ki-21, even the Helen's defensive armament was no longer an advantage. She was considered a fish out of water by Japanese strategic commanders, air service support crews, and squadron commanders. Now, the Army did not really want the Helen for overwater operations in hot, humid environments. As I mentioned, the Helen was designed to be used in Manchuria against the Soviets and the Mongolians and Chinese, where the engines would be easier to maintain, that supplies would be closer to Army sources, and she would supposedly face lighter fighters that the Japanese felt they'd proven they could defeat, rather than the heavily armed, fast Allied fighters. Against Polikarpov I-15s and I-16s, I can see this. Against a P-38 with 4 heavy machine guns and a 20mm cannon in her nose, well, enjoy your flight today aboard Parachute Airlines. All of this led to frustration among pilots and crew as much as among commanders. Sortie after sortie had to turn back rather than press attacks against Port Moresby or Darwin. On missions against Australia, crews and their escorts aborted and returned to base the moment that Helen spotted Spitfires, and they took their escorts with them. Even after Ki-61 Tonys and Ki-45 Nicks started to replace the Ki-43 Oscars in New Guinea, this was not enough to stiffen the backs of pilots who knew that the Army's fighters lacked the range, armament, armor, and pilot skill to face off against the Australian and American defenders. The Helen's low service ceiling of 30,000 feet, impeded already by the weather, stresses on temperamental engines, terrain, and the weight of a combat load, meant that she couldn't even reach that height. And without any altitude behind her, she couldn't really pose much of a challenge to interceptors, observers, or radar either. As a second Hiko Sentai of Helen's arrived in Madang in the summer of 1943, the pilots described themselves as being just added to the rotation of awkward purposelessness. Now, the Japanese found that their armament could be improved, but the real problem was improving their gunner skills. Believing as usual that it was the faulty carpenter who blames his tools, they blamed the gunners. And that helped nobody because only practice and training could really improve their skills. But this was Japan. Once again, doctrine and design were both at fault for the Helen's failure. It didn't help that the 20mm cannon was also a very new thing for the Japanese. The Helen was the first Japanese aircraft with a powered gun turret. The cannon made a tail attack a deadly option for Allied fighters, but Allied pilots knew from their own bombers that a stern attack was a deadly option. This put the primary responsibility for defending the Helen on the single 12.7mm gun in the nose and the 2 7.7mm guns in beam positions, and to a lesser extent the dorsal position. Now check out my video on fighter tactics against bombers to see the Americans' favorite passive attack if you want to get an idea of this. So poor gunnery skills and a general unfamiliarity with the turret mechanism only further impeded the Ki-49's ability to defend herself. That's if she even got off the ground. Now, when she was used, after the hell of Rabaul and the disasters over Darwin, the Japanese decided to strike at Port Moresby, at night. The idea was that fighter interception would be more difficult, and the thoroughly demoralized crews would be less likely to turn tail thanks to the protection of the dark. Who knows what evil lurks in the heart of men? The night fighters do. So do the flak guys. It was just more hell. Improved bomb bay lights, upgraded armament, and new tactics made little better for the unmotivated, poorly supplied crews sent over Allied strongholds. Despite the extensive night bomber training courses at Hamamatsu for Helen crews, the raids and intruder missions were meaningless and costly. Beginning on 20th of September 1943 with a pair of Helens over Port Moresby, the Japanese would strike at the center of Allied shipping, but do little. The Helen was used for strikes as far out as Cape Gloucester, as they tried to stem the tide of Allied shipping off New Guinea and New Britain, but raids often ended like that of Boxing Day 1943 when a half-dozen Helens set off never to be seen again. Most raids were actually only flown by 1, 2, or 3 bombers. They were never in the numbers necessary to have any impact on the Allies whatsoever. Those aircraft that survived the raids needed to cannibalize other Helens to keep flying, even though more were needed to fly in what supplies were available. So you're having Helens fly in supplies so that other Helens can use them, and they still have to cannibalize still more Helens that are left on the ground. Through 1944, 10 transport companies were equipped with converted Helens to keep supplies and men flowing into Wewak, but none of this could stop the Allied advance, and none of it really helped the Japanese Army Air Force at all. In fact, it cost more than it could ever possibly have reaped. Plans for mass attacks against Allied airfields being built never materialized, despite this being the one mission profile that might have succeeded. Wewak and the satellite at Madang were abandoned with the rest of the New Guinea defenses, and dozens of Helens were just destroyed on the ground and left to rot as the Allies cut off the Dutch East Indies and western New Guinea from the rest of the collapsing Japanese Empire. On mainland Asia, the Helen would finally be used as a primary bomber in a strategic role when the 62nd Hiko Sentai was stationed at Sungai Patani, Malaya, in February 1944. Now this reconstituted unit was intended for strikes against the vital crossroads of Lido on the Assam frontier. Japanese attempts to push towards India were stymied by the constant flow of supplies on the Lido Road, and the Helens were further delayed by airstrikes from India against any sign of Japanese airfield construction in Burma proper, meaning that they would have to remain in Malaya for the time being. Finally, on the 27th of March 1944, led by Lieutenant Colonel Nobumasa Haga, 9 Helens took off for Lido. As 3 Vics approached the target, Allied fighters rose to meet the Helens and downed 8 of the 9 bombers. The survivor limped back only to crash in the Burmese jungle. Haga and 68 of his valuable pilots and aircrew were lost in a massive blow to the Japanese Army Air Force. Despite this, more missions were flown. Each one ended in nearly complete losses in mission after mission, and eventually the campaign had to be completely abandoned on the ground and in the air. Now, through the war, the Helen would always be a rare sight for Allied pilots. The Sally was cheaper to manufacture, used less resources, was more familiar to crews and commanders, less likely to break down in the tropical heat, and was easier to maintain, even though her vulnerability would cripple the Japanese Army Air Force's ability to field a bomber force of any significance by the close of 1943. As the Japanese retreated from New Guinea, the Donryu units went with them to the Philippines. At the same time, with the surviving Helens from Singapore, Burma, the NEI, and New Guinea placed in the Philippines, the Helen could also be finally said to have achieved its goal of becoming the primary Army bomber. Of course, by then, it was also the only Army bomber left around. With the remaining Helens in Manchuria collected into the new 95th Hiko Sentai, nearly the entire inventory of Helens was prepared to fight off the inevitable Allied typhoon against the Philippines. However, once there, the Helen was used as a troop and VIP transport in China and Philippines over the Philippine Sea. They used her as an ASW patrol aircraft, and this was especially important as the Japanese Army tried to protect their transport and tanker fleets. Yes, the Army's fleets, because Japan. Allied subs and airstrikes were just wreaking havoc, especially Allied submarines. They were sinking Japanese merchant ships left and right. As mineral, rubber, and petroleum resources were all far afield from mainland Japan, this was quite an undertaking. It was all in vain, however, as the Japanese Empire was soon cut in twain. The Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Indochina, Burma, and their Thai allies were no longer able to safely traverse the waterways connecting them to Japan, Formosa, Manchuria, and the Philippines. Even maintaining connections between the home islands, Korea, Manchuria, coastal China, Formosa, and the Philippines was difficult, no matter how large the Fourth Air Army may have been. the Japanese were simply inadequately prepared and undermanned where anti-submarine actions and proper reconnaissance and transport were concerned. As the Army failed to protect Japan's lifelines, the Navy was being pushed back in the island-hopping campaign leading up to Leyte Gulf and the beginning of the liberation of the Philippine Islands. When the American attack finally came in 1944, few Helens had survived. The overwhelming majority had been destroyed on the ground during the November and December Allied air offensives, or they'd been rendered hors de combat through continuous use as transport and ASW patrol bombers. Any sign of activity garnered the attention of Allied fighter bombers just waiting to pounce on Japanese airfields, and the Helen was no exception to the target list. Even the trainer Helens from Hamamatsu were deployed for the final act of the play, when together with any surviving Helens available, they were assigned to those undertaking that fatal duty of special attack missions, the infamous kamikaze. Tucked away in the Philippines, Okinawa, and Kyushu, overloaded with up to 3,527 pounds of ordnance in a bomb bay, or her nose filled with a 1,750-pound charge with an impact fuse, each bomber would await their final crew assignment for that final mission. For most part, they never came. But this was where the Helen ended up her last days in the war, like most Japanese aircraft. Now, the Helen turned out to be one of the least fielded bombers of the war and have one of the shortest manufacturing windows. Only 819 were produced, the first batch of 129 Ki-21s being made between August 1941 and August 1942, and the Ki-49-2 being made from September 42 to December 44. With severe airframe and powerplant limitations, she had well-defined handicaps, and with limited airframe adaptability, attempts to expand her potential were bound for failure. She had been rushed into service after only preliminary evaluation over China for a war that would not be, and she had little role over the Pacific for the war that was. Her defenses were formidable, but her crews were ill-prepared, her payload weak, and her commanders flummoxed on how best to use a bomber for which there was little purpose. The Helen simply did not meet the order. The Army had wanted an armored heavy bomber with long range that was also light, fast, nimble, well-defended, maybe a horn that played La Cucaracha. Given the limitations of the airframe and available power plants, further improvements were for naught. The Ki-49 high recon variant was unarmed and designed to be a patrol aircraft, which she did somewhat successfully if still redundantly, since even if we ignore the complete wall of communication between Navy and Army preventing the Army from using naval recon, in the Army's inventory was the vaunted Ki-46 Dyna that was available and superior at the task. The proposed Ki-49-3 never entered production, and only a half-dozen prototypes were built in the first half of 1943. Engines were once again to blame, as although the Nakajima Ha-117 offered 2,421 horsepower, the Japanese just couldn't quite get it right, and the materials that they needed to build the engines were becoming scarcer, so that went the way of all things. Now, some interesting versions, besides the Ki-58 mentioned earlier, included the Ki-50 prototype, which ironically took the designation of the Mitsubishi project against whom the Helen had originally competed, and she was supposed to be used for air-to-air refueling. She had hoses, extra tanks, and pumping equipment installed to refuel other Helens for strategic strikes, but the technology was immature, the capacity for extra fuel insufficient, and the missions over Mongolia for which she had been designed and strikes against the Urals and Upper Siberia just were unnecessary since the war with the Soviet Union only lasted weeks. Another attempt to make the Helen relevant was the 4th Army Air Supply Headquarters at Vivak in the late 1943, early 1944 period. As Allied medium and heavy bombers took their round-the-clock toll on the Japanese in New Guinea, the Japanese needed a way to fight off bombers at night. So they adapted the Donryu into hunter-killer pairs, with the hunter having a high-powered searchlight in the nose and the killer having a 75mm Army frickin' artillery piece slung underneath. You heard that right. Boomstick go boom. A 75mm artillery piece. I wish there were pictures of this available, but I'm sure you can imagine it. Oh, by the way, it didn't work, in case anybody was wondering. You can't just slap a field artillery piece to an aircraft and turn it into an interceptor. But, good show. The hillbilly in me likes it. So that was the Helen. And on one final note, there was a planned replacement, which actually resembled the Helen greatly, and that was the Mitsubishi Ki-67 Peggy. Of course it was Mitsubishi. Now, the Peggy was designed for a Manchuria-Siberia border conflict, just like Helen, and her mission profile was supposed to have her being a dive bomber, a strategic bomber, a tactical bomber, a reconnaissance aircraft, with heavy armor, lots of defensive armament, a high top speed, incredible maneuverability at high altitude, so, again, everything but a horn that plays the cucaracha. The Ki-67 was not to really be any successor to anything. Teething problems abounded, the design was a bit of a mess, neither the Army nor Navy variants had much to say for themselves, so Peggy is Peggy, and, that's a problem for another day. Now, you know the deal. Hit like, subscribe, share it. If you're in a group online, spread the word. This was supposed to be a video of just building the model, but there's really no video on the Helen out there, so I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, and I look forward to hearing in the comments. My sources, of course, are below. I wish there was more in English about her. There's really not. But until next time, this is Claire, and I am the Warbird Mistress. Take care.